No. For the last few years, and I will leave Alex to share whatever parts of his journey he wishes to share, but Alex has become a truly insightful contributor, regular contributor to UK column news. And let me say that, you know, what the YouTube numbers show has no bearing to the number of people who actually watch this stuff. That's true. You know, if you actually look at my YouTube channel, you'll see that I'm allowed to have about 1,500 views of any episode of Fracking Nightmare or Morning Livestream. It can go a few either side, but 1,500, and that's the point at which it gets cut. And UK column, it's pretty much the same. I think it's about 3,000 or 4,000, but basically once it gets to that, it's cut. And of course, the purpose is to create the impression that, yeah, it's not really that interesting because no one's watching. But it's a much bigger number. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, the reality is that once people have seen something, they're not going to unsee it, right? So it's out there. And so UK column has become a truly, you know, remarkable and extremely important source of alternative news and analysis. And this is where Alex makes his truly outstanding contribution, particularly on what's unfolding, you know, within the Middle East. So it's an absolute pleasure to invite Alex Thomson to AV9 and make his debut on the stage here. So Alex, thank you.
Thank you. How's the volume? All right? Good. Ian said yesterday that the graveyard slot is straight after lunch, but straight before Sunday lunch is also a bit of a dreary slot for a history lecture, so I'm going to try and pep it up a bit. But I'm entitling this Inventors of Evil Things, because we're seeing more and more, certainly we did yesterday, that every domain of life seems to have been cornered by groups that serve their own interests, even as they are elected public servants. And you can call these cabals or cartels. We're going to discuss both those words in this talk. I've taken this from the book of Romans chapter 1, where the wicked people who govern the world are called inventors of evil things. And Ian suggested boiling down my précis for this talk into this phrase, exposing those who see the world as their fiefdom and humanity as livestock. And these are not randomly chosen words. We're going to look at the words fiefdom and livestock. What is a fiefdom? This is death by PowerPoint, this presentation. If you want to close your eyes or look away, don't worry. I just didn't have the time to get to boil all down all the information and find nice illustrations for everything. So it's text or nothing, I'm afraid, but nothing's all right if you just listen, okay? A fiefdom, which is a formal term from medieval history, is a domain, a physically delineated domain, where profit from bodies and souls, this is discussed in the Bible, trading in souls, is reserved to a particular bloodline, so a secret order of descent through non-overt family descent. And it's an area where human misery is the preserve of that bloodline. Anyone else who tries to profit from human misery will get turfed out, sharp elbows. Brian mentioned Ronald Bernard, the Dutch former elite banker yesterday, who I've got a forthcoming interview in the can. I have to trim it and subtitle it still. But if you go to DVM TV channel, there is a subtitled 5-part interview with him in which he talks about this. And he says, fiefdoms are like pyramids, and they're granular. So if you go down to a lower level, you get smaller fiefdoms, and you're able to operate in this town, and this corrupt bunch run that town council, and so on. It's very, very territorial. The title to a fiefdom isn't constant. It transfers by shuffling people around, even within a single bloodline. If Rothschild number 1 isn't performing too well, he'll be replaced by Rothschild number 2, the heir and the spare idea, by promotion and also by co-option. For example, those Chinese are quite bright lads. We're going to have to bring them into the system, is a big example of co-opting. There's been a lot of that in history. If you fail, you're sacrificed, sometimes metaphorically and sometimes literally, I'm afraid. But the franchise goes on. So what's the etymology of the word fief and feudal? Same root, actually. It's an old Indo-European word for cattle. Who's the cattle? We are, yes. And feudal lords are like their father. If you know the quotation, ye are of your father, the devil, they are like their father. They are deceitful, jealous, and misanthropic, meaning human-hating. It's hard for us to imagine this, because we love humanity, don't we? And most people do, but if you are in one of these systems, if you're born into these bloodlines or co-opted into them, you hate humanity with as much passion as the spiritual enemy of mankind hates humanity. Here's a quick definition of fiefdoms, not using the word fiefdom. This is the first of 3 videos. The definition is given here by Lord Maurice Glassman, who founded a Blairite faction called Blue Labour. And here he is giving away, perhaps inadvertently too much, to a film of Spanish documentary makers in 2010 who made a film called Secret City, with financial assistance from the University of Roehampton, interestingly enough. Here he rattles off in 1 minute what a fiefdom is and how it's transferred. Listen for the geographical names, which are in reverse chronological order. Here we go.
Essentially what happened in the Tudor period with the establishment of the Royal Exchange is that London took over from Amsterdam, which itself took over from Antwerp, which took over from Genoa, which took over from Venice, which took over from Ostia, which took over from Piraeus, as the arbitration centre in the international maritime trade. So London essentially got the Atlantic, set up Wall Street, set up Hong Kong. These were the new maritime centres in the new global economy. And all of the disputes, where there were disputes in contract, they were settled in the courts in London.
The last word was city. We had to cut it short because of an annoying music segment that comes in. What did you hear him say there in his kitchen, very informally? Maritime trade centres, and particularly what institution sits in each of these cities in turn? The dispute resolution mechanism, the apex of the pyramid. So if you have a problem with the law of the sea or your trade, your cartel being interfered with, the rules not being followed, that's the city where the fiefdom resides. He went back as far as Piraeus, the port of Greece, which, by the way, the Chinese have now bought. He dishonestly or self-preservingly doesn't go further back in time to Tyre and Carthage, where the system really originates. And it's the idea of sitting in an island just outside the geographical mainland of where the economy is at its wealthiest in the day where you live. You live in an island just off that, Tyre, Venice. Some of them get destroyed because of the envy that's caused. London, in a sense, is the island off Europe. And from there, you seed yourself out. Tyre goes to Carthage. The Greeks go to the Near East. The British go to Hong Kong and America. And you control global trade through these areas. And you also do deals with pirates, so that, for example, we keep the Straits of Malacca as a pinch point, and Aden as well, so that the pirates around those areas make sure that no untoward people like the Chinese get into the market. So very casually there, he's just rattled off one of the secrets of history, that it doesn't really matter what empires are there or who's on the throne. In the Venetian model, as it's often called, the black nobility model, what matters is who's creating the money. A lot of you know about that. And more particularly, who knocks the heads together in arbitration. London is still the headquarters of that arbitration. In many senses, we're still in the British-dominated fiefdom. Does anyone know the one international organisation which has got its headquarters in London? For example, you've got the UN bodies in Geneva, the OECD in Paris. Most continental capitals have got one or more of these. No, in London. I'm talking about international diplomatic bodies. No, it's the International Maritime Organization, IMO. And why did we want that? Because it controls the trade routes, the behavior at sea, which used to be the job of the Crown of Aragon and then was given by the Pope to London. And it also controls satellites. We're looking today at evil, poneros in Greek. There is a formal study of evil, who is evil, how people become evil, why they become evil, what they do in their networks of evil. The study is called ponerology. And here is Andrew Łobachewski, a Pole from the communist period, who had to rewrite this twice from memory after burning the manuscript when the secret police came to the door. He realized in the communist period, with some of his smarter chums at university, that there was some kind of mechanism at work to promote evil and evil-inclined people and bring them into fiefdoms, if you like. And so he lost his statistics the first time he burnt it because you could only get them from the material. But he rewrote the content, really. The gist of it is there in very good scientific language. Political ponerology, a very good study of the evil mind and the evil hive mind. We're about to go back a long way in time. So what sources, what kinds of science do we need to look at a very long time ago? I'm going back to 12,000 years before present. Well, classic sciences, there's 3 of them that look at the history of early man. Anthropology, the triad of them. There's genetics, linguistics, and archaeology, and they each have their contribution. They're not the only sciences that can help us, but they're the most evident ones. You heard from Dr. Downing yesterday about mitochondria, right? Mitochondrial DNA. Now, you get those from your mother. There's a bit of complication, but basically mitochondrial is maternal DNA. Only very recently have we been able to synthesize or to sequence the Y chromosome DNA, the paternal lineages, which shows actually where the groups of warriors and conquerors went around the world, not necessarily taking their women folk with them. So now we can actually see where the power has spread out across the world, which to my mind is more interesting than where the mostly sedentary populations of mothers have been. And the main guy for that is Luigi Luca Cavalli-Sforza, and he's cooperated closely with the other two chaps who are doyens of their own sciences. In linguistics, you've got Merit Rulin and some Russian linguists as well of his ilk, who've basically, this is very summarizing, basically proven that all languages do go back to a single source, and particularly that the dominant groups in the world were a single entity not so many thousand years ago. And archaeology is finding the same. If you look at Colin Renfrew, a Cambridge archaeologist who's, I think, still alive, yes? He makes the same point, that the human race, okay, you can argue over whether it's thousands or millions of years or what, but it was in its period of speciation first. We were developing our physical features, our brains, and the things Graham was talking about yesterday. And all of a sudden, late on in time, there's a revolution, and we get the ability to use our brains in abstract ways, fully formed language, and the use of symbols. You've just heard from Jay Dyer about effectively what you could call symbology, the use of esoteric symbols to make an impression on mankind and spin them certain stories. That became possible at this period I'm talking about 12,000 years ago. How do we know that there were advanced civilizations back then? Here's the 1513 Piri Reis map. Anyone heard of it or seen it? Mm-hmm. So you'll know then that what you're seeing here is an accurate charting of the course of North and South America and Africa. And on some of the maps in this genre, which are called the Portolano maps from the northern Italian traders of that time, you can see the un-icebound coast of Antarctica, if you know that. Sometimes even with the west and east of Antarctica as two distinct islands with a channel through the middle. Right, so there was, before the last ice age, I think the evidence is now pretty overwhelming, there was an advanced global culture, and it was not nice. That's the key thing to say about it. It was not run by nice people. The lemnos stele, if you follow Blackett's work, some of you do, I think, the Welsh among you particularly, you'll know about this. But this is a stele, so an inscribed stone found on the island of Lemnos in the Aegean. And it describes how a people related to the Etruscans were dischuffed with their chieftain and they went off somewhere else. According to one version in mythology, the people on Lemnos said, well, we're too vigorous, we want to dominate the fiefdom idea again. We can't all dominate this small island, so some of us are going to have to head off west and found a colony in Italy. So they did and became the Etruscans. The Romans then displaced them. The Etruscans are a good example of the science being developed by Arthur Farham, among others, called geoglyphology, which is going to strategic locations in the world and finding what lines have been carved on monuments, tombstones, and the like, following the vectors of them, so taking the bearing of where these lines go, and working out which geographical points they relate to. And this is the age-old human tendency to say, mine, hands off this area, just like any other animal would do. The Etruscans left some very interesting geoglyphs, according to Farham, and one of them in particular shows that they claimed the territory, including the key points of Beaver Island in Lake Michigan, Malcayacta in Peru, the Bay Area, California, Cape Horn, Caleta Hornos, Patagonia, Recife, Brazil, and Lusitania, which is now called Portugal, up to the river Minho or Douro, but not Galicia. So even back then, fiefdoms were so geographically delineated that Portugal and Galicia were two separate entities, and whoever came on to take over those territories, the Celts, for example, in successive waves, or the Romans, they didn't disturb the old fiefdoms. And you see this again and again in medieval and modern European history. New crowns and new peoples take over, as it were, the dominance, but the idea of which fiefdom they've taken over, which territory they're allowed to operate in, as Ronald Bernard says, remains very constant at the level of noble or bloodline elitists. So here's the Etruscan tombs that he's been working on, Farham, circa 800 BC, and he's gone into detail on the lines in there, and this is the kind of stuff that comes out. There's Etruria, and there are lines there pointing to Skellig Michael, County Kerry, a couple of other points in the west of Ireland, the Orcadian Neolithic settlements, also Shetland, because it's an extreme point. You see, they're saying, we own as far as there. We know about these islands and we own as far as there. One of them goes to the Portuguese-Galician border on the west coast of Spain and Portugal, the Azores, the Canaries, Cape Verde, and then some of them going off to North America, to Recife in South America, and to Patagonia, and back to the source of it all in the Levant, in the Near East. So this is, I think, pretty incontrovertible, that people were sailing, and they were already getting the idea that the elite of this territory will own that territory and can operate the people there like livestock. No matter what happens ethnically or in terms of changes in religion or technological development, we still own that lot. These are very consistent ideas. So here's the Nazca star glyph. Some of you know about it. It's pointing to Hawaii, Portugal, the West Africa, Portuguese Guinea, Buenos Aires, Reykjavik, Iceland, New Zealand. It's very, very accurately plotted, and only discovered, of course, when people started flying above the ground and seeing these marks. I don't think there's any way of claiming this is a fluke or a fake. This is Cabo Galeta, I think it is, in Patagonia, and it's pointing to Hawaii, Fiji. I can't remember, read what the chap's written there, Mr. Farram, I think it is, but the Mexican Pyramid of the Sun. So the entire Americas and Pacific is marked out. I think you're getting the idea. So this takes us to a period about as far back as we can sensibly look, the end of the Stone Age, the Epi-Paleolithic. You'll know, I think, from Graham Hancock and Robert Beauval, some of you anyway, about this, that the Sphinx seems to be sitting in the crucial alignment to dominate the Earth and look at the rising sun and say, thank you, I've taken possession of the Earth and I'm sitting on it. We know a lot about this because of something called precession, with an E in it, yeah? Or axial tilt. The Earth tilts and it rotates around the stars, and it takes 25,400 years to complete a cycle as seen from Earth, that the constellations move round. Now, it so happens that as different as you can get from now in that cycle is obviously 12,000 years or so, because it's halfway between the 2 points. If you cycle around in 25.4 thousand years, 12,000 years ago is as obviously different an alignment from now as you could get. And it's precisely the alignment of 13,000 years ago that's fixed on the ground in sites like Teotihuacan in Mexico, Orion's Belt fixed in the pyramids in Egypt, Draco and Leo fixed in Angkor Wat. You'll see some examples of this. So more examples that the constellations as they then were, noticeably different from how we see them today in the sky, were fixed in the ground by these temple complexes where gruesome things took place, by the way, human sacrifice and the like, and very advanced energy projects, it seems, as a pretty incontrovertible way of saying, we are the bosses of the Earth, we have left our mark here. This isn't the people of the world, this is the fiefdom owners, as it were. This is the period when the farming revolution happens. Again, who is being farmed? If you're a hunter-gatherer, it's not an obvious equation to say, I'm going to settle in a town, because then you're going to be forced to live on rations, to do set work for a boss over you. You're going to have lots more children than you have to as a hunter-gatherer because of the necessity of farm work. It's far more strenuous. You get diseases from being clustered together. You get mental problems from being urbanized. But also what happens in this period is, and as I say, J. Dyer gave one example of how this has ended up, you get the use of symbols and symbology. This point in mankind's history is when he starts to think, okay, well, I don't live just in a tribal band anymore. Before that, I knew Pete, who's the tribe's carpenter, and John, who's the head man, and Bill, who's the priest, and that was about as far as it went. But as soon as you start having clothes of office and symbols like temples that look the same wherever you go, then you can go and live anywhere else and think, there is the priest for this community. He is the law for this community. And so you can cluster far more people together and they can live together in urbanized communities. So this is when fiefdoms and treating people like cattle really get going. Languages become fully formed in their grammar, and according to some people, the delineation of fiefdom at this point, because of the technology being so good just before the Atlantean flood of this time, that actually they switch the way that they demarcate where the fiefdoms end from a way of calculating on longitude, where you have to go across lots of territory in a straight line, which is very time-consuming and dangerous, to a magnetic way. They had worked out how to do that so that they were leaving magnetic bearings in these geoglyphs they were carving so that you could sail around and still come to the right point on the far side and say, okay, here's Hawaii, this is the edge of our territory. Some example of this from one of the precursor civilizations to the Inca civilization in Peru. This is the Chimu civilization. They've recently, just a month ago, made this gruesome discovery that large numbers of children were buried alive and otherwise sacrificed. So this was going on at that time, many thousands of years ago. It's claimed here as a reaction to extreme weather and a way of imploring the gods to stop doing the extreme weather. There's many theories about that, but you'll see the same all over the world. More evidence here. The main point is that more evidence that the people controlling humanity were very evil at that time already. I was talking to someone this morning who's just come back from living in Turkey. We were talking about these sites. Göbekli Tepe, Çatalhöyük, a whole city in the ground, Derin Kuyu, meaning deep well, which seems to have been built because there was so much stuff falling from the sky that people had to take refuge underground. The Chimu I mentioned, Teotihuacan in Mexico. All of these sites where people lived for generations doing nasty things like sacrificing underlings to stay alive. They thought it was necessary or they were told it was. This is a period when the mystery religions, this is the ideological fuel of the fiefdom owners, really. The mystery religions get going. The idea that we have a secret creed and those in the know understand that might is right. The idea of the all-seeing eye, very well known, I think, these days, comes from that period. The idea of technocracy, using a select few, maybe 4% or so of the population, to do your bidding as technocrats in return for some favors. They live in the middle of the pyramid. That comes from there. The idea of a sacerdotal, that's a priestly caste, which is illuminated. It's given extra knowledge than the rest of humanity, and is beyond good and evil, to quote Nietzsche. That comes from this period. The idea of Gnosticism, salvation through knowledge. The idea of merchants, the mercantilist class, being the underlings of the bloodlines. And the battle for the mind begins at this time. The Bible calls this period really Babylon the whore, the whole system of prostituting all your knowledge in return for power. They infiltrate every religion and even every denomination of every religion at this point, sad to say. And the main idea they have is overturning rulers, overturning princes. This is sometimes presented positively. For example, in the American Revolution, you can have some sympathy with those who said rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God, because they were being tyrannized by George III. But the same excuse was used in the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution and many others to bring in worse people ruling the country than before. So that the justification for this all goes back to these mystery religions. What are the ancient empires? Well, you've got Egypt, so I better speed up at this point, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. They all have their distinctives, but they're all developing along the same line. The book of Daniel, for example, and many other ancient texts describe how one empire takes off where the last one had left off, and they become more and more refined till you get down to Rome at ruling the world. In a sense, we're still in the Roman era. Rome and its offshoot, the British clique, still rule the world and consider themselves the owners of America and anywhere else that you might think is powerful outside Europe, Russia even. The thinking among the bloodlines in the Italian, French, British system is still that we have licensed them to operate within our fiefdom on our behalf, like a franchise. Ancient philosophies, again, too much text to read, but the idea is that about 500 BC, all the world religions get going. And here again, you can see that good is turned to bad in all the ancient philosophies. The pre-existing Hindu philosophy is kind of corrupted into an idea that you just need to fight for the in-group. Stoicism, Epicureanism in Greek, thought, Platonism, Aristotelianism, Kabbalah, which later takes over Judaism, although it wasn't original Judaism. All these philosophies have the idea of do what you like and even actively do evil if you're an elite person, because that will keep you in clover and it will also kind of generate good karma in some strange way. So some Greek texts that prove that. These are not the same text, they're two different ones. This is Plato's Critias on the left, and here you can actually see, in the top line, he talks about Enakis Chilia Ete, 9,000 years ago, and he's writing in about 500 BC or so. So Plato is actually setting in stone in the classical canon. We've known about this for centuries, but no one talks about it, that sometime around 10,000 BC, there was a cataclysm that sunk Atlantis, and the survivors kind of bedraggled, made their way to Egypt and started again with all the advanced knowledge and technologies that they'd managed to preserve. And from Egypt, they seeded themselves out as fiefdoms and bloodlines again. The Greeks knew this jolly well, but it's not taught these days. From another work, Plato's Republic, you've got a passage here where a character called Thrasymachus is made to say, I believe that those who are capable of absolute injustice and who have the power to subject cities and nations to themselves, the bloodlines, are good, intelligent people. But you perhaps imagine I'm talking of people who snatch purses, he says to the debater. To be sure, things like that can be profitable too, petty crime, if they go undetected. But they are insignificant compared with what I have just described. And then Thrasymachus is challenged. I'm surprised if you're putting injustice in the category of excellence and wisdom, and justice among the opposites. Well, replies Thrasymachus, that is just what I am doing. So this is Plato's thought. Yeah, so Plato and Aristotle, their descendants become two rival systems. Very basically, Plato dominates in German and Eurasian thinking, and Aristotle dominates in Roman and British French thinking, and these are the two wings of the cabal, as it were. But they both believe in squeezing the people for every last drop of their energy. And a longer example with a nice passage in the middle, this is from Timaeus, also by Plato, and he describes how a Greek chap who thought he was the bee's knees went off to Egypt called Solon, and in the middle you can see perhaps, oh Solon, Solon, oh Solon, Solon. This is an Egyptian priest who kind of whacks his forehead and saying, you silly Greeks, you don't understand a thing, and then painstakingly explains, look, we know in Egypt that there's been many cataclysms in humanity when humanity gets too big for its boots. And every time we have to start over again after disasters involving fire and water and so on. So the idea of relaunching the bloodlines. I can perhaps skip that, I've said something about it already, but these philosophies go through to the present day. The bloodlines cluster geographically as well. At UK Cullen, we have a lot of casework involving the northeast of Scotland, actually right up to the top there, Caithness, Wick, all the way down that side of the coast, and into Inverness area, which is a bit of a centre of things, across to Fraserburgh, which is horrendous, and down to Aberdeen. Lots and lots and lots of satanic ritual abuse and men going missing, presumed sacrificed on satanic feast days, lots of royal connections, lots of esoteric connections. We see similar clusters, just taking Britain, within West Sussex, North Yorkshire, South Wales. These are embedded areas where, they're very poor areas, of course, but apart from West Sussex, perhaps, that's only recently got rich. But the idea is that the lords of the manor in these areas are Satanists of the kind you were hearing from Brian about yesterday, and they are so from generation to generation, and the locals are just there for their pleasure, just there to be used and abused. One of the most important geographical clusters I'm going to show in some later maps is where the Franks were, a collection of tribes on the continent, basically the core area of the Roman Empire, so France, Germany, Benelux, northern Italy. That's always been the core area of the Roman Empire. And these people have got, the Franks, although they're spread across those different nations now, they've got some things in common. They work like stink, they keep their heads down, they accept statism much more than we do, because they call it solidarity. They accept the existence of cartels, and they are the core territory of the Roman Empire. Everyone outside that, the Brits, in some ways, are vassals of that. There's some indications of what's going on in Scotland. Again, you can see the same places that the same lady, Wildcat, she has a very good blog called Spider Cat Web blog. She plots all these, and you can see that the sacred sites, Callanish in Lewis, the Orcadian sites, Isla, Mull, and some of the ones near Lothian, Rosyth Chapel in Edinburgh, I'm sure some of you have heard of Roslin, sorry. They all form a pentagram around Fort George and Loch Moy, in fact. Why is the British Isles so crucial to this? Because we were at the edge of civilization. Well, the answer is, you remember St. Michael's Mount that Brian was talking about? That's St. Michael's ley line. It goes through the two St. Michael's Mounts, yeah? The one in Brittany and the one in Cornwall, and ends up at Skellig Michael. And there's lots of elaboration involved, but basically, people spent, I could show you so many of these maps, but these are just some to show you that sacred sites are very carefully placed thousands and thousands of years ago, at least 5,000 to 7,000 BC, so 7,000 to 9,000 years before present. Already the territory is being marked out, and the people who think they ruled the world from Egypt, having escaped Atlantis when it was destroyed, they think, okay, those islands over there are a good base to go from, because from there we can plonk out to the rest of the world, to America and Russia in particular. So they festoon themselves in Britain and put all these sacred sites in. There you can see Egypt did the same. They were such good navigators. They went as far as New Zealand and apparently left some survivors there. Greg Clark writes about this. The Indus Valley Civilization, Madagascar, Angola, Cape Verde, Kola Peninsula, etc. One way out in Russia as well. There's the ley line again. I'm not saying that I believe in this, but the important thing with this is the people who are in charge believe it. Right? If they believe it, then they act upon it. Turkey, Egypt, Ararat Pyramid Triangle, and if you follow those lines through, you get to Britain again. And there's a very well-known ley line in Britain where a lot of sites of importance are. The Sphinx. The main question about the Sphinx is what is it and how old is it? Nobody can answer either of those questions. The Arab name for the Sphinx is Abul Hawl, meaning the father of terrors, which means the most terrifying thing you can possibly imagine. And that's because the head of it, if you listen to Satanists testifying, they say that there's knowledge in those circles that the head has been basically softened through the years. The original heads were horrendous kind of beast of prey faces, because in those days it was overt that the bloodlines were saying, we are here to devour you, literally to drink your blood and eat your energy and so on. And as we got more civilized and woken up as a society, they've had to tone it down to a bit of a pussycat. But, you know, if you go by the sidereal calculations, those two authors I mentioned, especially Hancock, he says that if you look at the star alignment, it may be 50,000 years old. Other Satanists who've not read Hancock, because they've just come out of abusive rings and can hardly read, have left similar testimony. You know, these very unfortunate people, they've overheard while being abused that the Sphinx is so old and symbolizes the same things. So I believe it. Power centers again. France is a very important power center. There's someone calculating the French power centers. We have at least one French woman in the audience who'll recognize some of these sites. I think France comes back to the idea of Francia, the territory of the Franks. Now, I now live among them in the southern Netherlands, and although they're Germanic people, they're very different from the English or any other British, because they've got the attitude I just described: conformity, productivity, and obedience to authority. And so the bloodlines thought this is one of the reasons they struck out from Rome to Britain, because the people living in between were so jolly useful to them. They could work like stink and not ask any questions. So this is the kingdom that the Merovingians had, an important bloodline, and you can see middle Francia going down to Italy. So that core coffin-shaped area, Benelux, France, Germany, Switzerland, still very, very important. You saw the CERN dance yesterday, you know, and that is the very center of that territory. This is where a lot of the families really live who rule the world. There's actually the Franco-Swiss border and points going out from that people have calculated to, again, the very same sacred sites. North America as a possession with certain key areas. The Americans were allowed to think they'd gone independent, so were the Russians, but they were kept on side as far as the bloodline people are concerned. When Columbus sailed, they already had the carve-up. Portuguese territory, and the northern half was then given to the Templars, but that was originally Portuguese as well, was in the area delineated by these glyphs, these geoglyphs. In between them, Mexico and the islands was the territory of Spain, and that's why Columbus headed off there. And he, by mistake, discovered the area that Spain claimed, but that's because he was knowing where he was going, and he knew that this was the area where he would be allowed to operate on behalf of the Spanish crown. He was not himself a Spaniard, but because the Spanish crown had sent him out, it was a kind of official licensed plunder operation. If you read Joseph P. Farrell, he has an elaborate theory. I can't endorse all of it, but I'm not rubbishing it either, saying that actually there's a whole latitude and longitude-based grid, which he calls the grid of the gods, because the bloodlines present themselves as the gods when they are, in fact, only humans, with a bit of a satanic inspiration, I would say. And they have left mostly pyramid-type sites in all these locations from which they can control the energy of the world. I can't go deeper into the physics. That's one area I'm not specialist in, but at least read it with interest. A couple of other illustrations of that. And one more. How are we doing for time, Ian? Halfway? Okay. Angkor Wat, Draco, or the constellation of Draco or Leo, as it was at that time of 13,000 years ago, is depicted on the ground by the way that the temples are laid out. If you overlay the constellation of Draco as it was then, you will see that. So there's a band going right round the Earth, Central America, Mexico, Peru. If you read some of the deeper materials, Springmeier, for example, or Robin de Ruyter, you'll find what they have determined, and they've worked hard at this and put themselves at personal risk. So, again, I give them benefit of the doubt. They're serious historians. They've worked out the 13 bloodlines, and these are the people who really control the world. Okay, I'm not going to read it all out. Astor, Bundy, Collins. Half of them are British dominated. Okay, Astor, Bundy, Collins, Dupont, Freeman, Kennedy, Lee, the Merovingians, who think that they're going to supply the line of the Antichrist, although they give him another name, the son of Apollo, Onassis, Rockefeller, Rothschild, Russell, I come from Bedfordshire, the Dukes of Bedford are the Russells, and Von Daun, the Dutch, who got in on the act. It's suggested that they come from Balkh in Afghanistan originally, but they've bred themselves so much that they look European and whatever. So this is why I don't believe in ideas of a Jewish-based conspiracy. Certainly some elite Jewish people are involved, as a lot of other nationalities are involved, but the thinking seems to have come from Central Asia, actually, a long time ago, and these families just present as French, British, German, Jewish, whatever they want. Here's the second clip coming up. Do you recognize the chap here with the famous beard? George Bernard Shaw. Here he is talking between the wars, and he's basically Lady Astor's darling. She sponsored him to go around doing things like saying, we should abolish the English language, and we should abolish people. So this is what perhaps the most important of the 13 bloodlines for England, the Astors, have to say through their spokesman. There's Latvian subtitles on this because the Latvians suffered the loss of 20% of their population thanks to this thinking under Stalin, so they've got a real interest in finding out where it came from. So I'm going to play this. This is a very short one as well. He's talking about what to do with humanity if the bloodlines get their way.
The popular British playwright Bernard Shaw supported Hitler in the mass media. The left supported Hitler not because he deceived them. They knew Hitler would kill. He said he would. In fact, it was why they supported him.
You must all know half a dozen people at least who are no use in this world, who are more trouble than they are worth. Just put him there and say, sir or madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? If you can't justify your existence, if you're not pulling your weight in the social boat, if you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive, because your life does not benefit us, and it can't be of very much use to yourself.
Bernard Shaw believed in mass killing by category, not usually by racial category, but by category, you know, the idle, the unfit.
Killing off the parasites within society was what Marxian socialism was about.
It demanded in a London newspaper that the scientists should devise a humane gas.
I appeal to the chemists to discover a humane gas that will kill instantly and painlessly. Deadly by all means, but humane, not cruel.
So that's apparently one of the greats of English 20th century literature. And like a lot of people in Hollywood today, as you've been hearing from Jay, they're pretty talentless people, but they actually get promoted and funded that way. And it was a bit of a mushy clip of Shaw speaking himself, but the core of it was that people would be called once a year before a panel, death panels, anyone? And be asked to justify your existence. Are you producing more for us than you consume? If not, we can't keep you alive. Your life is of no interest to us, and it can't be of much interest to yourself either. Okay? So, what are the bloodlines up to more recently? 1996, Martlesham Heath, one of the sites near Ipswich where I went as a GCHQ officer to do some secret squirrel research. One of the things they were doing, I wasn't even allowed to look at, it was beyond GCHQ level classification, was this, I now know the name of it because it came out in the press apparently in '96. It's called the soul catcher, and it's a chip that will record people's souls. So this idea was there well before the pig's brains experiment that Brian was talking about. BT's Artificial Life Research Team says it hopes to record the electrical pulses that pass down our nervous system onto memory chips. One member of the B team loftily proclaimed, this is in 1996, the year of Dolly the sheep, "This is the end of death. And within 30 years we wouldn't die." Where are the bloodlines headquartered? Well, you know that the EU shuttles, or the European Parliament at least, once a month from Brussels to Strasbourg. It's been suggested this is why. On the left is, in the south of Belgium, where Godfrey de Bouillon, the leading crusader, had his fortress, is the Château des Amoureux, where the sisters of the Illuminati have their main hangout and sacrificial center. And on the right, just outside Strasbourg, it's a German name, but it's within France, in Alsace, is Dreieneggusheim, the three towers of Eggusheim, where the men have their jollies. Not the right word for it, really. And it's been suggested that that's why the European apparatus comes down to Strasbourg once a month, is to get their orders. I better skip a couple of these for time's sake, but in the middle of this slide, I would point out that there's, the Illuminati is not an order as such. You've heard perhaps of it, but it's a strategy. You should really spell it with a lowercase I, because it's an idea of being illuminated while you are a member of something else something perhaps originally innocuous like the Freemasons or the Church of England or the Roman Catholic Church or the Rotary Club. While you're a member of them and can pull the strings of those networks, you are also illuminated. And within the illuminated orders, 0.001%, so 1 in 100,000, goes up to a level called Palladium. And the other top name for the top outfit is Moriah, a Hebrew name meaning seen by God. But wherever God's mentioned, it means Satan, you see. You can see some of that. They like hiding out in military intelligence. I came across a couple of them in my time. I didn't quite know what they were till afterwards, putting 2 and 2 together. And they have long-range planners, according to Christopher Story and again Fritz Springmeier. These are the Order of the Garter, you know, the Queen and her select members, the Order of the Quest and the Keepers of the Dawn. They make the multi-generational plans. Yes, there's perhaps too much history for now, but just to show you that it goes a long, long way back to Hermes, you know, a Greek, not the god Hermes, but an ancient man called Hermes Trismegistus, who had developed the theory of ancient knowledge. He may have been the same man as Enoch. And the idea of gematria, using numbers and symbolism again to show the plans. And the idea of controlling food, even in these days of Anglo-American dominance, it's still the core area on the continent, Belgium, Switzerland, France, Germany. That's where the food control is. If you look at these grain big five, they control the world's grain supply to this day. And they are sitting in the territory of what I showed you used to be called Middle Francia, later called Burgundy, with its port at Antwerp. Antwerp was one of the cities that Lord Glassman named. And within that territory, they still have the core task, which can't be farmed out to any of the other sub-areas, of making sure that nobody is fed who ought to die. Right? And these 5 companies are, I'm not saying they're evil themselves, but the owners may be. André, Bungenborn, Cargill, Dutch-based, Continental, and Dreyfus. I could talk about Demiurge and Archon in detail, but the key point there, yeah, okay. The key point is the Demiurge is this gnostic idea that God wasn't really too bothered with Earth, one of the key lies of Satanism. So he said to Satan, get on with it, do your thing, and twist humanity any which way you want. So Satan thinks he has license to present himself as God. It's the thinking of these elite families. It's not a biblical doctrine or anything. It's just a reality of these bloodlines that they believe this. So Satan says, okay, I'm God. Then the level below me is the minor gods, fallen angels, if you like. And when they breed with mankind in genetic experiments or whatever is claimed to have happened, the people at that level are called an archon, meaning a ruler. Plural in Greek is archontes. And these are the people that Ronald Bernard were working directly for. They were going to the offices of these people who were people, human body at least, but the mind and the soul have been taken over by something else. You know, these are perhaps the people who meet at that castle near Strasbourg as well, telling the EU what to do, telling the Bank for International Settlement what to do. That's the core philosophy of these movements, really. That was perhaps mentioned too much last year to go into detail. Graham Downing very usefully pointed out, first slip of the tongue, very usefully pointed out last year, alexithymia, the idea of having emotionless people, yeah? People whose emotions have been switched off chemically and neurally. And the Russians, he talked about the cosmism and Sobornos, man as machine. Sci-fi, throughout the 20th century, this is Jay Dyer's point again, has always been the genre in which people have been licensed from H.G. Wells onwards, Isaac Asimov and many others, to say this is the future of mankind. They're not crazy or wicked ideas that came into these people's heads. They became bestsellers because they were intended to be, because they were telling us what our future was going to be according to these bloodlines. John Newton, who was gloriously converted later in life, was previously a slave trader between West Africa and the Caribbean, where the life expectancy of the slaves on Antigua was 9 years. And this comes back in the Holocaust again with the I.G. Farben idea of calculating slaves' fat reserves as part of what you take out of their rations to work them to death, and then boiling them down for soap afterwards and so on. And I know there's some skepticism about the details of the Holocaust, but I have to say, you know, some people did undergo that fate. There's no denying that. If you look at the people in Western Europe, every town in the Netherlands has got these monuments to the Jewish people and others who were deported. Where did they all end up? You know, you can't say the whole thing's made up, no way. The system goes back to that point, and John Newton says in the 18th century, by rigorously straining their strength to the utmost with little relaxation, hard fare, so useless and unnutritious food, and hard usage, we're getting back to that now, aren't we, to wear slaves out before they become useless, and then to buy new ones to fill up their places. So that's the strategy he was serving. Can anyone identify either of these two quotes? Völkerabfälle means the refuse of peoples, the trash of humanity. No. 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 The top one is Friedrich Engels, and the lower one is Karl Marx. But before he gets to that point, Karl Marx says, as the philosopher Hegel said. Okay? So this shows you how many philosophers in certain schools of philosophical thought have been so in bed with this that they've openly written for 200 years and more, we're going to have to massacre half of Europe in a succession of holocausts and genocides, and of course the rest of the world, which they care even less about, because they're not useful to us. Remember George Bernard Shaw talking about us, and he's just a mouthpiece for the Astors and the other bloodlines there. I think I'm going to skip most of this history because it would really do with a better a lecture of its own, but here are some key points. You can at least, if you see the DVD afterwards, see what's going on. 1200s is when this really gets going in Europe. The Franks go off and do the Fourth Crusade. Venice gets control of the grain trade. The line through to Asia is established. What remained of Babylon has remained there as Baghdad, and so the Baghdad trade to the east. Then the Mongols kind of get license from the bloodlines. Perhaps the Mongols are related to where these bloodlines came from in Central Asia anyway, but they get license to sack Baghdad and sack China. So the whole of Asia's opened up to a new boss, which then gets in bed with the Venetians, the bloodline people again. Yeah, I don't know how I can shorten this, so I better just leave it out. But the money is important, right? Europe has been bleeding itself dry with wars and famines and pestilence for the latter part of the Middle Ages. Then all of a sudden it picks itself up. And what you see is that the Franks, which are now in a form of French state, start aggressing because they're the licensed military arm, which they're becoming again because the Americans are being discarded and the French are taking that back to themselves now. French have for centuries been the key military power in this when the Americans haven't been. They start aggressing against Italy, which has got the cultural heart of Europe and the best ideas of the day and so on. And then England takes over. There's a Reformation divorce, but it's the Roman bloodline saying, okay, you go your own way, but you're still with us, really. They set up the Muscovy Company, and John Dee, the Elizabethan strategist, has this idea of a green empire. America and Russia are where the resources are at. The people are too primitive there. We're going to colonize them, and we're going to start using their raw materials and use them for military expeditions. The monetary innovation starts at this point as well. Then the merchant class starts dominating. Nothing inherently wrong with being a merchant and supplying people's needs and food and so on, but it's much less preferable for mankind than an aristocratic or democratic model because merchants get together in cabals and stitch things up, so this is very useful to the bloodlines. People are forced into cities through this period, and they end up penniless, so they have to take horrible industrial jobs. So the Industrial Revolution, poverty and glamour and squalor was not a mistake. It was planned, particularly in Britain, I think, and France. So much going on here, but the key thing is things are coming out into the open now. It's called the threshold age because a lot of the secret evil religions or ideas within the religions are coming out now. For example, within Judaism, you've got a strand called Frankism, earlier form of which is Sabbateanism, and they openly start preaching the doctrine, now is the time to mix it up and cause evil and havoc in the world because that's how we'll save it. And the same is happening in various branches of Protestantism and Roman Catholicism at the same time, less so in the east of Christianity. I think most of you know about the Bank of England, or as my colleague David Ellis calls it, their bank in England. And the £12.5 million that is given in debt to the Crown at that point, which removes the Crown's ability to mint money, removes our monetary sovereignty, all the fiat currency in the world, according to many of our good sources, actually is leveraged off that original £12.5 million from then. So that capital will never be repaid. And the limited liability, so a company can get away with anything. The Anglo-Dutch model starts then. Which of these flags is the East India Company? No. The one on the left is the East India Company. What's the flag on the right? We've got some Americans in the audience, you should know. It's the Grand Union flag of 1776. What does that tell you? Whenever the Brits, which is really the bloodlines, strike out from their British centre of operations, I'm looking at an Irish member of the audience, they do it in Ireland as well, what they do is they go off to other continents and say, okay, there's our national flag, and these stripes, which also are in the flag of Catalonia, because the Aragon crown used to be the key player before Britain took it over, 15th century, these stripes represent the waves of the earth or whatever, so we've been given license to sail across the world and dominate. So at the moment of the US declaring independence, the bloodlines were already saying with their first flag, actually, we're just like the British East India Company. We're there to further the interests of the Crown in other domains. The East India companies in Britain and the Netherlands default on their loans and fold the Amsterdam Bank. Remember Lord Glassman talking about Amsterdam being the last centre before London? Well, these centres, they remain successful for a while, but they have to be wound down in the end when the plan is to go on to a new one. So Amsterdam was wound down by the East India Company of the Netherlands simply defaulting on its loans. Then you get London primacy. Psychological operations begin. The Germans really targeted through the horrors of the 30 Years' War, which is the previous century, and many other attacks like the Napoleonic possession. How many people now know that the French occupied, or I shouldn't say the French, Napoleon's troops occupied Germany for nearly 20 years and committed atrocities there, 1795 to 1813. So all this theory about German threats to France or Russian threats to Europe as if the threat was east to west, no, actually the proven course in history is that France tends to invade Germany. Germany tends to invade Russia. And where the troops come the other way, it's usually to liberate people. Mid-19th century, again, lots of detail, but the point here is the merchants have gained the upper hand completely. There's a realization in society that our past was not all sweetness and light. In 1851, I think it was, or 1850, Tennyson pens the famous line in his sonnet, "Nature red in tooth and claw." So people are realizing, even within classic Christianity, that actually we had a horrendous past. At the end of that decade, of course, the origin of species. I'm not quibbling evolutionism as a valid theory. I'm just saying Darwin, as probably some of you know, was put up to it by Galton, which is, again, one of these bloodline families, his cousin Galton. And a lot of the ideas are in social Darwinism, in particular, are basically Malthusian, population reduction, keeping only those who can work well. This is a bit arcane, but I'm going to do it anyway. I pointed to the Callanish stone on the Isle of Lewis on the map. Now, people of the Isle of Lewis actually had the sharp end of this because the lairds of Lewis, from this time onwards, they were bought out. So a succession of kind of nouveau riche merchants took their place. And so they started to be treated through the Highland clearances in much the same way as these people were doing through their industrial empires through the rest of the world. And you may know that HSBC, which started as the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, was started mainly by Mattison, who was the Laird of Lewis at that time. And of course, they were running the opium trade. It goes all the way back to what I was talking about with the Baghdad operations. There's so much struggling behind the scenes to control the drug routes through Asia, you know, to keep the Chinese opium addicted. And so at this point, the Brits have taken over this operation, particularly the Scots. And I just quote this to show that, although it's not well known, there were people who were jolly well aware even then of what was going on. So I'll read the Gaelic verse and then the translation. So this Isle of Lewis poet wrote this in the 1800s. Vacushaka malast an opium, hinled moren de juntus, varich na schienig en davert, skrisid na sloil as a function, muncher gun choignes gun trochkere, dulich en lawn ans na gunches. Some of these impostors, he's talking about the new lairds who've bought their way to power, some of them trafficked in opium. They gathered a huge trove of riches. Their vice made the Chinese suffer, their kinsfolk destroyed by the poison. Men without kindness or mercy who were hard to prick in their conscience. So the poorest and the most dispossessed knew perfectly well, even people who didn't speak English, what was going on. So there's really no excuse that mainstream history hasn't taught this. It was perfectly well known that cartel operations were at the heart of it. First World War, that's when the geopolitics really kicks in. I'll probably hive this off into another talk because there's no time for it now. The interwar, this is an interesting case study I can do in 1 minute. After the First World War, Germany has to be rearmed so that the model can be kept going. So how's that done? Well, there's a Krupp family just below the 13 bloodlines level, so very powerful in this system, known for their sadism. And they were alchemists in the Renaissance days, so they were Rosicrucians, one of the secret orders. Their full name is Krupp von Bohlen, and under the name Bohlen, they go on in America. Before the First World War, they owned the Kruppstahl factory at Blessing and Company in The Hague. We've got a Hague man in the audience, I know, so these names will be familiar to at least one of you. After the First World War, Germany's name was Mud in the West, and even in the neutral Netherlands. So what do they have to do? They sold the Krupp holding to the Hollandse Industrie- en Handelmaatschappij, which sounds a very Dutch name, of course. That changed its name to a German name, Siderius Aktiengesellschaft. The shares were quietly held by 2 Krupp directors and later sold to select Dutchmen. And this was used as a holding so that the Netherlands could actually be the base for the Germans or the German war machine, I should say, to rebuild itself between the wars while the sanctions and the reparations were still ongoing. Piet Smit in Rotterdam, still a world-leading name, Machinen- and Apparatenfabriek in Utrecht, and Ingenieurkantoor van Scheepsbouw in The Hague. So actually the Germans were in control of that, and behind the scenes the Germans, or the bloodlines from Germany, are still in control of Dutch economy. I've spoken to the number 2 of a Dutch political party confidentially and said, why won't you get out of the European Union? And he's replied, we can't, Alex, because the Britain can do what it wants, but we're a province of Germany. So this is well known. This was rumbled in 26, and Queen Wilhelmina refused to intervene. And in fact, in 38, when she was told you're about to be invaded by the Wehrmacht, she refused to believe it as well, because they were in on it. Yeah? So there's some more details of Americans who were in on it. A couple of things I should point out, I think we're getting towards the end now. The Second World War, one of the outcomes of that was that Russia was excluded from the cabal system. So a lot of the annoyances under Stalin, well, more than annoyances, the genocide that Stalin inflicted and so on, was his rage that he'd been left out of the profit-sharing model. And so Truman tried to make sure that he would be threatened with being bombed back to the Stone Age in what was first called Operation Clean Sweep. Unthinkable was the British side of it, declassified in '99. And then the most recent iteration of that was called Operation Grand Tour. So all through the Cold War, I just quoted the name of Kennan on a slide. He invented the term Cold War. He was one of these oligarchs. The idea was the Russians were being kept in check. You know, we will carpet bomb you if you try to get a piece of the action because we are running the fiefdom here. And we've been reporting on this now, the Franco-British unitary state. The extreme conditions of 1940 forced this so-called emergency, which had been planned for a long time, where the British proposed to the French, let us become a single state for military purposes. That's now coming back to the fore. Better skip that. Oh, maybe not, I'll read the slide. Theodore Dalrymple, a well-known dissident writer, a psychologist or psychiatrist, talks about the emergence of technocracy and corruption in our day. He says, the result of bureaucracies being set targets by government, which is the core of this model again, is organized lying. Thatcher ignored the lessons of the Soviet Union and became something of a Leninist. She instituted, have you ever wondered why it was that Mrs. Thatcher abolished local government, for example, and broke the miners' strike? Because she was, in fact, something of a revolutionary. She instituted the regime of legalized corruption under which we live and which Blair expanded with low cunning. Blair saw it as an opportunity to create a nomenclatura, a kind of privileged class. Thanks to Thatcher's faith in managerialism, this inhumane doctrine, private looting of the public purse takes place on a scale not seen since the 18th century. I was going to have a clip there, but I'll skip it. But the point is the Queen's chaplain, Gavin Ashenden, if you recall, he was sacked ignominiously and then left the Church of England. And in a video he made explaining why he'd left the Church of England, he said that the Church has moved from revelation to social revolution. Illustration of the bloodline control of churches. This, I think, again, we can skip. I've explained most of it. This is quite important. Core techniques that the cabals use. Perhaps if you watch the video, you can freeze it. But these are all ones that I have found through UK column casework. And the key idea is keeping people dumb to the fact that their monetary power is being stripped off them while they're not looking. Even if you're in an association, a society, a church, a local body of any kind, paying your dues becomes more and more onerous. More and more rules are imposed on you. You can't manage your capital asset locally. The centre claims a right to own the capital, but you have to pay the bills and keep the infrastructure going. Right? This is the model which is spilling out of the City of London, which, because it's got the fiefdom rights, as it were, so it's being spun out to the rest of the world. And those are the things that it rests on. You have to freeze the screen again to look at that. Fiat currency, administrative law, party whipping, all the things UK column reports on the evils of. These are basically making up the rules as you go along, all of these systems. And denial of fiduciary duty, denying that you're actually there to represent the people at all or to serve them. Why is the tripartite alliance bombing Syria? Because actually it's not three nations at all. I've focused on the power centers in these three territories, France, Britain, and America. And these are the orders which, by the best researchers, are said to run each of those territories. So it is the members of these orders getting together, or meeting without meeting in person perhaps, who decide on military action. The Knights of the Star in France, the Order of the Garter in Britain, and the Society of the Cincinnati in America, and of course, who's a member of them? The Bloodlines. If you remember the Dutch Army arrow, this is the reverse of it. This is what really happened. Before the war, Britain, France, and America and Benelux sent their money via Switzerland into Germany, and then sucked Germany dry during the war, took the money out, kept it offshore in Argentina and whatnot, and then put it back after the war, creating the Wirtschaftswunder, Switzerland, again, the center of much of this, not even in the EU or the UN, but from Basel and Geneva, a lot of this is run. Roots of Nazi agendas, you'll hear more about this from Thomas Sheridan, he's expert on it, Arnon Erber, Thule, all these secret societies, the idea of being a Herren folk. They actually go back to British bloodline thinking again, so Halford Mackinder, the father of geopolitics. He's the guy who, via Hess, induces Hitler to think all these ideas. Even Leonid Ivashov, who was the Russian chief of general staff in the early Putin days, has written about this. They know very well. All these we see in UK column casework, all these Nazi policies, which are not even particularly German, they're kind of bloodline policies imposed on Germany and then farmed out again. Zersetzung, calling people mad who oppose you. Corporatism, the cabal, like IG in the war, IG Farben, IG Metall, using its own slaves with its own intelligence service, its own communications. It was a mini-state, basically. The experiment of having the cabal run a state in its own right, that goes off to America, Averell Harriman. Barbarossa and T4 you heard about from Brian, we can definitely see these being relaunched by the City of London and the bloodlines there via the Conservative government. You know about MK Ultra. And I think the finest response to all of this is the Dutchman who chaired the Bank for International Settlements when the German members of the bloodlines marched into his office after the war and told him what their plans were, and he just said, go to hell. So how do we beat them? These are very important. British Constitution Group can tell you more. Jury nullification, insisting that we ratify treaties, banning external training of public servants. And this is a very important one when the Queen dies, God forbid, but it will happen, refusing to elect him because constitutionally we have to. And we have to exacerbate the divisions between the various factions in the cabals. For example, in the US, you've got the Pentagon versus the State Department, sometimes called the Red Empire versus the Blue Empire. In Britain, you've got some who are working to flatten and destroy Britain, the kind that Brian reports on. They call Britain their main enemy. These are global revolutionaries of the Trotskyite model. But there's others, especially in the esoteric religions, who think Britain's the mother country and should be the center of the earth. So we have to exploit these divisions. In banking as well, the BIS and the economic hitmen are sometimes at odds. Here's a 3-minute clip. Do we have time for a 3-minute clip towards the end? Good. This is Will Paulick, who is a chap who gave an interview which he only wanted released posthumously. So he gave the interview in 2001. It wasn't released till 2010, 3 years after his death, at his request. And here he's talking about him being an expert in passive radio frequency identification chips, RFID, back in the 70s. And the sound might not work, it's very faint, so we're going to whack up the gain, and if not, I'll at least tell you what he's saying. It's about 3 minutes, but it's worth listening. If not, I'll explain it to you. He's talking about the situation in the 1970s.
Arranged by a friend of mine with the CIA and another friend of mine with the State Department at the time to introduce this technology to what we felt at the time were the right parties to use this new technology responsibly. Now, I hadn't heard about the remnant or any other religious beliefs at the time that said that everybody was going to be implanted with some sort of marking system, la the beast or 666. I wasn't even aware of that stuff at the time. And I was taking this as a serious solution to a potentially a problem that would not go away. And it was interesting, we met in this room, and because of the tight meetings we were involved with, certain people would not give you their full name or where they came from. I just had to trust that my two contacts had contacted the right parties to be there at the right time, and that they would all be responsible individuals. There was a mistake. After that meeting, I discovered that 2 of the people in the meeting had never been asked there, yet they knew about the meeting, they knew what it was about, they knew who was going to be there, and later research indicated that one of them actually worked for the Department of Agriculture and one of them worked for the Department of the Treasury. What prompted our looking at these 2 men was that the way they asked the questions they asked, the attitude behind them, even the body language, indicated that they had reasons for the use of this technology other than the one that was intended at the meeting. In fact, their largest concern was, how fast could we make a couple billion of them? And could we each give each one of those a unique identity number? Now, this particular pill-shaped device, very minute, had a lot of flexibility in its capabilities. It was basically just almost a transponder. You would send a frequency to it, and it would respond back with its unique number, which could not be changed once the chip was made. Yet there were a lot of capabilities that could be added to this chip, such as monitoring temperature, blood pressure, pulse, and even waveforms out of the brain. But that was for research down the road. What was amusing to me a few months ago on a website that likes to collect articles on the unusual is that a lady out east had a chip removed from her body in 1999. They had it blown up on the website. And it was a slight modification of this chip from Denver with some of its enhancements. And it was put in her, she believes, in either 1980 or 1981. What was amusing about this was that this gentleman never had to worry about money again. And he quietly passed on a lot of this technology to somebody we never knew. And this concerned my contacts in Washington because it never went anywhere with them. Somebody else took it and ran with it.
Oh, that's clip ends a bit early, but he says we never found out who took it, but it was the wrong people. Just all in a nutshell, really, a single case study of that the world's technology being stolen by a group who say we own it, thank you very much, and being used for nefarious purposes. Last slide I must mention, we've mentioned Peter Hofschreur. He's more in the child abuse or the reporting on child abuse side than reporting on cabals. But he has got good reason to believe that he's being targeted by the successor to Jimmy Savile in the North Yorkshire pedocracy, you could call them, the people who use paedophilia for political purposes, because he's very close to that person. So he's been followed through 3 European countries, and now he's been declared mad, although the only psychiatric assessment he ever had was in Britain, and Dr. Gethins, who saw him, said he has no mental illness. He's now been sectioned for life in Austria by a Professor Manfred Walzel, who reportedly does this for a living since he was caught out in a crime allegedly in the past, and he now signs sections to order for political dissidents and other undesirables. We get daily upset calls from him saying they're trying to make me take drugs, they're using prisoners to beat me up, and the moment I lift a finger in response, they'll inject me and destroy his mind, which of course is what they want to do. It being Austria, we can't do a common law route. We have to get a lawyer for him. The hard truth of it is we still need, I believe it's 6,000, if not 7,000 pounds within a week to make any chance of him getting the one lawyer in Austria who's able to take this chance on with a modicum of success. I already have a very kind audience member's pledge here to donate 1,000 if it can be matched by other people's donations. So if you would like to see me after this talk, unfortunately this website, which has been set up by a friend, only takes credit card donations. But this is one way you can show that we are getting back at the cabals because they think they have absolute power. And the only way of getting back at them is by combining ours. So Peter Hofschreur is an exceptionally worthy case, and I can tell you about the genuineness and the need of this case if you like. But unfortunately we do need, or he needs, several thousand within a week to avoid going down for life. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. And you know, it's a crucial element, and you know, the beauty is that the combined level of knowledge and awareness in this room, I know, is truly outstanding. Every one of us has different pieces of the jigsaw. Some of those are shared pieces, some are unique pieces. And Alex, I mean, your contribution, I think, to hopefully stimulating curiosity to actually look at how we've got to where we are today is absolutely crucial as part of this process. And so thank you so much for joining us at AV9. And you're around, I think, until Tuesday.
Yes.
So there's plenty of opportunity to have discussion and get more insight from Alex.